Thanks, everybody. My name is Joe Watson. I'm the Pima County Attorney's Office Communications Director. So today we're going to hear from Pima County Attorney Laura Conover, our Chief Criminal Deputy Dan South. We're also going to hear from our Victim Services Director Virginia Rodriguez. We also have Dr. Jasleen Chatwal from Sierra Tucson and Ed Mercurio Sacqua, the CEO of Emerge. I also want to thank Lieutenant Shaner from TPD and Assistant Chief Anderson from TFD for being here. Once they go through their presentation, they'll be happy, Laura and PCAO will be happy to take some questions. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. Thank you so much for being here to give me this opportunity to share important information with the community. Muchas gracias por darme esta oportunidad de compartir información importante con la comunidad. I want to thank also everyone who is here with me, with the Pima County Attorney's Office and subject matter experts that you're going to hear from briefly. I want to start with my most heartfelt condolences to all who lost a loved one and suffered harm in the horrifying event on July 18th, to the neighbors who survived that night, and to all who experienced loss and harm from the event. We are here today to briefly discuss what occurred on July 18th, and then to move more importantly into information that we can all use and should be using today and always. The skills we need to identify rising escalation and mental illness, and the resources we can and should use and share with each other so that we can take action before the ultimate event, such as something on July 18th, occurs. Unfortunately, July 18th is just the worst example, most recently, of a growing and alarming concern community-wide. And this is why we're here to discuss prevention. Importantly, ordinarily, I cannot and will not discuss a pending case. This is critically important because a prosecutor should not and must not influence the community and then end up swaying a potential jury. But July 18th was a unique event. There is no pending criminal case. There are no pending criminal charges because the suspect is deceased. Further, the Pima County Attorney's Office portion of this event, the critical investigation into the officer-involved shooting, concluded late on Friday. And due to those two pieces, I am now at liberty to be able to discuss the event briefly, and as I said, more importantly, the prevention we need to be engaging in. So first, I want to start with a critical clarification. On July 18th, we witnessed a fire and a multi-part crime scene. Also, what was noticed at the time and has been reported in the media is that there was a fire directly across the street in January. It is critical to report accurately that that was not an arson. It was thoroughly investigated by both the Tucson Police Department and the Tucson Fire Department, and all investigation concluded conclusively that that was not an arson. It is human instinct to try to want to make order out of chaos and perhaps to fantasize about conspiracy theories, but that's an important clarification that we need to make. So then we turn to July 18th itself. Due to the severity of the incident, our criminal chief deputy Dan South kept the case himself and responded to the scene personally. I decided to join him. Dan, would you please discuss July 18th?
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon. My name is Dan South, and I'm the Chief Criminal Deputy here at the Pima County Attorney's Office. On Sunday, July 18th, I was briefed by Homicide Sergeant with Tucson Police, Scott Haynes, about a multiple casualty event that occurred here in Tucson. The intersection of South Campbell and East Irene was one of those incident locations. Because of the gravity of this incident and the importance to the community, the impact on our community, Laura and I both responded to that scene. When we arrived, it was pouring rain. The streets were flooded, but yet more than 100 first responders were on scene, and they were all cooperating with local and federal agencies to ensure that the scene was taped off, that it was cordoned, and evidence was being processed. The level of collaboration between police, fire, our federal partners, and medical personnel is something we haven't seen in quite some time. This cooperation makes me proud to be a Tucsonan, but also heartbroken for what brought us to this place. As prosecutors, our role is to, when we're arriving at a crime scene, our role is to observe and to listen. I lead an incredibly dedicated team of staff, attorneys, and detectives that all take a case from the initiation all the way through to a jury if necessary. The details that we observe firsthand on the crime scene are imperative in ensuring that we make informed charging decisions. And that's why Laura and I were there. When I arrived on scene, I immediately saw that Officer Danny Leon's vehicle was heavily damaged. The front end of the corresponding vehicle that was determined to be driven by a person by the name of Leslie Scarlett was also damaged, and it was just across the street. I observed multiple shell casings there on scene. Detectives walked Laura and I down Irene Vista through the next crime scene. It was determined that the house that was still smoldering was where the incident had initiated. As we're walking down Irene Vista, we saw glass across the street that had come from damaged fire personnel. We saw the vehicle, the Tucson Fire vehicle that had been damaged, and we saw the area where the firefighters had been shot at. Farther down Irene Vista, we waited, huddled under temporary shelters to protect from the rain, as one of our fallen neighbors was taken from the scene. This man was a good Samaritan who was simply trying to help pull other people to safety from the fire. And during his last act of bravery, he was shot and killed by Mr. Scarlett. He had been carried out of the line of fire by other neighbors and by fire personnel as they rushed him to safety. However, he did not survive. Detectives then walked us back to Mr. Scarlett's residence, where that fire was still smoldering and fire personnel were on scene tending to it. Inside that residence was the body of yet another victim. Outside in the street, medical personnel were gathering to attend to another victim, another neighbor who had been pistol whipped, hit in the head with a firearm by Mr. Scarlett. A Tucson fire captain had already been transported from the scene and treated for a gunshot wound. In the course of all this, we learned that several blocks away at Silver Lake Park was another scene. AMR emergency personnel containing 2 EMTs was ambushed, and those 2 EMTs were shot by Mr. Scarlett as they wait in their emergency vehicle. After walking through the scenes, I returned to where we began at the Tucson Mobile Command Post, where I watched footage from Officer Leon's body-worn camera. I watched this footage on scene and saw the exact moment that Officer Leon was driving his patrol car with sirens activated, and Mr. Scarlett sideswiped him, driving him off the road. I observed on that video that as Officer Leon exited his patrol vehicle, Mr. Scarlett stood approximately 40 yards away and fired at him with his handgun. Officer Leon exited the vehicle, took cover, and returned fire, shooting 6 times. One of those shots hit Mr. Scarlett in the head, causing him to succumb to his injuries 3 days later. That video was hard to watch, but it was important to my determination of what happened that day. So I'm tasked with reviewing whether the officer-involved shooting violated Arizona law. And here it is absolutely clear that Officer Leon's conduct and his actions were justified under law. Officer Leon returned fire only after being run off the road and being shot at by Mr. Scarlett. Officer Leon's actions were not only justified, but they also ended a chaotic and dangerous scene, a situation where more lives might have been lost that day. Lastly, I'll end this with a plea to our community. This situation, like many others, involved gun violence. And as criminal chief, I get phone calls in the middle of the night by these dedicated homicide detectives who I see day after day responding to another act of violence in our community. We've been on the scene together at 3 a.m. more times than I can recall. And what I'm asking for is this community to come together. And we address gun violence in our neighborhoods. Mr. Scarlett's caused so much pain to this community and to so many families. But he shouldn't have had a gun. And the question is, why did Mr. Scarlett have a gun? Our ATF partners did a trace and determined that that gun came through a private party sale, which wasn't documented, which didn't involve Mr. Scarlett, years ago. And how that firearm ended up in the hands of a man bent on committing the acts that he did that day is beyond me. Resources are available, but we must be proactive and aware. And at this time, I'll turn over to our Victim Services Director, Virginia, to talk to you a little bit more. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've prepared some things to say. My name is Virginia Rodriguez, and I am the Director of the Victim Services Division at the Pima County Attorney's Office. I want to start off by offering my condolences to the families of the victims of the incident that occurred on July 18th, along with my heartfelt sympathies to all those affected by this horrible incident. As part of the Pima County Attorney's Office, the Victim Services Division serves to support victims of crime in several capacities. Whether it's responding on scene with law enforcement to do crisis work with victims, working with victims, going through the criminal justice system by cases prosecuted by this office, or directing victims to appropriate resources with our community partner agencies. We are here to help and to serve victims. Though a criminal case will not result from the incident that occurred last month, there are resources for those that witnessed or were victims of this devastating event. Our office has been in contact with most of the victims that were directly affected by providing support and resources. However, if you believe you are a victim or witness for the events of that day, please contact our office, as you may be eligible for funds provided by our Crime Victim Compensation Fund. The Crime Victim Compensation Fund may be able to provide you with monetary compensation to use for medical expenses, counseling services, or reimbursements for funeral or other costs associated with criminal act regardless of prosecution. Please know that our Victim Services Division has and will always be here for victims of crime to provide support, comfort, and guidance through these difficult times. Thank you for your time. And lastly, thank you to our brave first responders who unwittingly became victims of crime that day in the act of being helpful. The brief video that will be shown next will further explain information about our services and the Victims' Compensation Fund. Thank you.
Violent crime can leave a devastating and lasting impact on our community. If your loved one has been killed in a violent crime, or you suffered an injury due to a violent crime, to witnessing a violent crime, or trying to apprehend someone accused of a violent crime, there may be financial assistance available for things like medical costs, mental health treatment, funeral expenses, or loss of wages. To find out if you're eligible for assistance, please call the Victim Services Division of the Pima County Attorney's Office at 520-724-5525 or email us at the address on your screen. We're here to help.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I think like everybody else has mentioned, I would like to offer my condolences to our community and all those directly affected by the events that occurred that day. As a psychiatrist and a mental health professional, I'm really here to share some of the signs of violence that we can see, and also to really highlight that violence and imminent violence sometimes is not really predictable and not easily predictable. What we can really look for are the signs of impending violence or behavior that seems to indicate that somebody may be at risk of engaging in violence. As a mental health professional, I also have to share that mental illness is not the cause of gun violence. I know that there's a lot of information, sometimes, and I would call it misinformation, about mental illness and violence being equated. There are some mental health conditions, especially symptoms, that can lead a person to be at a higher risk of violence. However, most individuals who are struggling with mental health issues are often victims of violence and not people who engage in violent acts themselves. Gun violence is a public health epidemic at this point, and definitely a public health issue that needs to be dealt with on a community-wide basis. Some of the risk factors of violence are going to be shared on these next couple slides. Some individual risk factors: access to firearm obviously leads to the most lethal and deadly type of acts of violence. And then we also notice that a history of victimization, whether that's you yourself having been victimized or the person victimizing others previously, both can be a risk of violence at an individual factor. Early aggressive behavior, so kind of an earlier participation in aggressive or violent behaviors. So if somebody has a history of violent crimes early on in life, that is another risk factor. So for us as family members and community members to know. Involvement with drugs, which also includes alcohol and tobacco, is another major risk factor. We all know that alcohol gives liquid courage, and sometimes thoughts that people are having that they may not act on or they may be able to prevent usually will become more imminent at that time. Anybody who's in high emotional distress, either because of a relational issue, family discord, job loss, economic instability, all of those issues are really important things to keep in mind when it comes to a risk of violence. Individuals who have intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities can have a risk of violence. However, that's less commonly lethal violence. That's more, violence within the home or not being able to quite understand a situation and having that type of aggression that can come out. History of treatment for emotional problems. This, again, does not equate anxiety, depression. We're really trying to talk about individuals who may lash out as part of their own health history. And this can be due to low frustration tolerance, difficulty with emotional balance. And then finally, some attitudes about, not really caring for other people, or we call it a low empathy and low ability to have regrets. That type of issue is another thing that's an individual risk factor. And then finally, exposure to violence, either in the community. So if you live in a community where there's a lot of violence that you see, or violence within the family, can lead to a person becoming numb to that behavior and thinking maybe that's really the way to engage in discord or difficult situations. And then finally, for family and social risk factors, I think these are things that we want to consider as a community and really look within our own family networks, our homes, our friends, and see that if somebody has poor family functioning, domestic violence, association with gangs, they've been socially rejected themselves, they may have a low level of community participation, which is that they're not really engaged in a community group or having close connections. That really can be a risk factor again. And then a history of substance use within the family. So being growing up in that sort of setup where there can be discord. And finally, diminished economic opportunity. So again, one of those things which we as a community have to come together and make sure that everybody's able to be uplifted so that we can be at a place where there's less violence in our community. And finally, this graph for violence mitigation, it starts with what can have the greatest impact at the bottom, which is socioeconomic factors, addressing inequity, addressing systemic and structural racism, funding social services, just things that can help everybody have access and not feel desperate. And then finally, also changing context to make individuals' default decisions healthy. So I think we heard from others here that having that background check, being able to implement those safety measures is important. And then having some extreme risk laws. Finally, clinical intervention, which is being able to counsel people, being able to intervene. That is something that happens at a more individual or family level, and so needs a lot of resources, but is also effective. So as you see from the bottom, it's the most widely based intervention, and then as you go up the chain, it's more and more personal intervention. And so finally ending in counseling and education, which is storing guns safely, being able to educate people. So even, talking today is sort of an individual level. Whoever hears this may be able to utilize this, but we want to really make this a public campaign and be able to educate everybody about risks of violence so that our community together can come and be able to reduce violence overall. Thank you so much for your time today.
Good afternoon. My name is Ed Mercurio Sacco. I'm the CEO at Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. And every year, nearly 6,000 people experiencing domestic violence and their children come to Emerge for services. Every year, more than 15,000 911 calls are made just here in our community related to domestic violence. And research shows that only about 1 in 10 cases get reported. So the sheer volume of what we're talking about related to domestic violence should be enough for us to take a tremendous pause as a community and really interrogate ourselves about what we're doing and not doing to address the issue of domestic violence. But it's also important to say that these numbers are just that. What's really important is the human beings behind these statistics. They are not faceless, nameless people. They're our friends, our family members, our coworkers, our neighbors. They're us. It's our community, our people that are suffering from this. And while most people's tragedies play out behind closed doors, don't make headlines in the news, there's almost always at least one person, maybe many, who know or suspect that something is not right in that relationship or in that home. But far too often we see it as a private matter. And so essentially what we do is we leave it to the victims to fend for themselves. But this is a public health and a public safety issue. And we as a community do have a role to play. We can offer non-judgmental support to those people that we know or believe are experiencing domestic violence based on what they want to do and what they know is safest for them, not based on what we think they should be doing. We can offer information and resources to people experiencing abuse so that they know they don't have to navigate this alone. And that includes sharing with them Emerge's 24/7 free, confidential, multilingual crisis hotline at 795-4266. And we also have to start offering help to the people who are using the abusive behaviors. Because if we don't, we are resigning ourselves to their partners never being safe. And look, it can be hard to know what in the world to say in this situation. It can be uncomfortable to think about how do I broach this topic with somebody. And we certainly don't suggest that people kind of plow forward and have these kind of conversations with either party without consulting with somebody, without having it be well thought through, without having it be private and safe, because even well-intended interactions from a third party can increase the risk for the victim. But silence can affirm that abuse. Silence can be deadly. And so we've got to find a way to use our voice and speak up on these situations. And so if we know somebody who is experiencing abuse or is using abusive behaviors, we encourage everybody to reach out to Emerge's hotline, 795-4266, to get help in figuring out how to broach that subject and how to have that conversation in the safest way. And in addition to that intervention role that we can all play with people who are struggling today, if we want to prevent people from struggling tomorrow, we've also got to acknowledge the socialization factors that serve as the root of domestic violence. We've got to change how we treat each other. We've got to change what we laugh at, what we stay silent about, what we tolerate or accept as being unchangeable, what we teach our children about gender norms and healthy relationships. Because there is nothing more devastating than having yet another domestic violence related death in our community and having somebody say, yeah, I heard things going on next door, but I didn't think I should get involved. I saw the bruises she had, but I didn't think I should say anything. I knew something wasn't right in that relationship, but I didn't know what to do about it, and so I said nothing. We have got to collectively, as a community, shift our mindset to prioritize other safety over our comfort. And we all have to be able to see this as our issue. Thank you.
I can't thank you all enough. And I think what we are hearing collectively is that the trauma and anxiety of 2020 is clearly bleeding into 2021. And we must continue to check on each other. The community needs to rise to the occasion, and it has and it will. The professionalism and collaboration in the middle of an absolutely traumatic and chaotic event on July 18th proves that we have what it takes to deal with this. And I thank our law enforcement partners as well, and I thank you for being here. We need to reach out to each other, and this is the moment in time. It's the difficult conversations that Ed was just talking about. We have to have these conversations with each other. When the Pima County Attorney's Office is out in the community on Saturdays, we bring gun locks with us, and it's effective. Or you can call the office and set up a quiet appointment to get one. They're free. Cuando estamos afuera de la oficina, allá en la comunidad, tenemos los condados de armas gratis para empezar la conversación important. You can take a gun lock and you can start that conversation, that difficult conversation, with a gift. I'm calling on the community, on the mothers and sisters and cousins and uncles, las primas, las novias, las abuelas, to have those difficult conversations and intervene. We'd like to offer the opportunity to take questions at this point. I want to start by saying again 622-6000. If that is a new number for you, please memorize it and share it. When you need a medical response instead of a law enforcement response, when there is crisis, it is 622-6000. Please help me get the word out about that. We want to take questions now, but I do also want to share with you that while we appreciate the Tucson Fire Department and Tucson Police Department being here present, I am a bit liberated to answer questions because my part of this is over. Their difficult parts in investigation of what happened July 18th will go on for some time. But I am able to take your questions. Yes?
In a previous high-profile case, Jack Maria, we knew more about the mental health history of that person. And later on, once the investigative reports were available, we learned that his family knew he needed help, tried to persuade him to get help, could not do that, and then felt they were stuck. What can someone do in those circumstances? What is an event or a behavior that reaches the point where authority can become involved?
I think the difference between January 8th and July 18th, thank goodness, is all of the work that Pima County put in after January 8th to increase and expand resources. Truly that tragedy, and it is on our minds, heavily on our minds, because of those who suffered that loss and going through this current trauma as well. And they are in our minds as well. But they worked together, those affected by January 8th, and they worked with Pima County to make sure that we would eventually have a crisis response center, an actual CRC, where by calling 622-6000, when we have these warning signs that we just went through, we have opportunities to get emergency help for people when we know and we can see that they're going down a path of escalating violence or trauma or anxiety.
So that is where to turn if you are in that situation.
Yes, you have a family member, a friend, a neighbor who's clearly struggling, disoriented, in need of help, in crisis, 622-6000.
Do they have to appear to be dangerous for this?
No, absolutely not. It's for those who are in need of help. If you are observing an emergency and people are in imminent danger and you need a police response, 911. If you're observing someone in crisis who needs help, 622-6000.
Let me circle back around.
Yeah,
this.
please.
I guess two issues here. We have a mental health issue and we have a gun issue.
Yes.
Tucson, like the rest of the country, we've seen a big increase in gun violence over especially the last 2 years. Dan, you mentioned that we all knew that he was a prohibitive possessor. He'd gotten this gun for a private sale to somebody else. Can we get some more details on that? And how does all of this play into what we're seeing with an increase in gun violence in the community?
Of course. Thank you for the question. The information I have is that Mr. Scarlett obtained the firearm. We don't know exactly when, but the ATF does know that several years ago there was a private party transaction where that gun transferred hands to another individual. We don't know who that person is. We don't know how the gun got from that person to Mr. Scarlett. And therein lies one of the problems, is that we don't know where guns are in our community. So I wish I had more answers for you, but this is where we are.
Any other questions? Any follow-up questions? You have some tremendous experts in front of you. Thank you again.
When we just did our own informal questioning out in the neighborhood, neighbors said, well, I never saw any sign of trouble coming from that house. Number one, did you all find anything to the contrary? Or was he, we heard the discussions that he was in fact very disturbed about what happened in the previous fire with his relatives. But other than that, no one saw anything that foresaw what played out.
I imagine that there will be much learned in the weeks and months to come about his personal history. But what I think we can say more generally is that it may not always be neighbors who can notice, which is why family and friends are so important. As Ed said, almost always there is someone in a person's life who is seeing the warning signs and just doesn't think it's their business or doesn't know how to take action. But with an extended family, as we often see, this is why we need to be encouraging family to reach out for help and engage in difficult conversations.
Now that he is deceased, are you able to disclose whether he was handled anywhere within the mental health system?
I don't have that information currently. I think that's part of the ongoing investigation that will be looked into.
Is there anything you see as prosecutor, county official, elected official, despite ongoing investigation, that you are recommending either in your office or countywide, working with your colleagues at TPD, change now, before the investigation is done, that could maybe, who knows, hindsight's 20/20, prevent another incident like this?
I think the key right now is exactly the kind of education and information we're just learning right now in front of you. And again, I thank you for being here. The frustrating part for Dan South and I and for Virginia is that the core mission of our work is that we are reactive. And when homicide after homicide and gun charge after gun charge comes in, we will prosecute, and our violent crime units, our homicide prosecutors are ready to tackle the most difficult cases of the day. But what we need desperately from the community is the prevention work. We can't solve this on the back end. Virginia's unit in the Victim Services Division has been at area hospitals around the clock for 2+ weeks now, and we will always rise to that occasion. But what we need now is to partner with community to start preventing at the root. Thank you all so much for being here. Mark, I just saw a hand. No, I want to catch you.
So, I mean, you guys are talking a lot about being proactive, community members, family, whoever's involved with these people's lives to, take the first step. Is there anyone involved with Leslie Scarlett that you have known that have seen this, that now during the investigation are saying, we saw these signs before? And can you kind of explain a little bit who they are, what they were saying?
That's part of the ongoing investigation that will go on for some time. But Mark, what I want to say about what this office and this administration has been engaging in since January was that we started community cleanups every Saturday morning. And there was a question about why we were doing that and what was the purpose, and they're out, picking up garbage. But what it was we were meeting with neighborhood coalitions, and we were going into these communities. We had been in the Vistas, we had been in Western Hills, we had been in Pueblo Gardens, meeting amazing neighbors, coming out, checking on each other, all those good people. In fact, the morning before the incident, we had been across the street at a massive toy drive. It was TPD and Pillars and Bridges, I think, was there, and it was the Western Hills neighborhood. They're working together to hand out toys to children stuck at home during the pandemic. We have to continue that work because that's how we check on each other, and that leads to the prevention work that we need to be doing. Thank you all.
And
Joe.
everybody, real quick, I just want to say what we could also use is your airtime and your space. We have that video that we created for our Victim Compensation Fund. We have other videos that we really could use some help. You talking to your producers, you talking to your editors, to get some space for us to air this stuff on your airwaves, whether it's radio or TV or newspaper, online, whatever. That's the kind of stuff that we need coverage on. So be expecting an email from me or something like that sometime soon. So that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you
it.
all. Thank you.